There's a specific trade a person makes, almost always without noticing they're making it. You give up the exhausting work of being a full, separate, contradictory individual. And in exchange, you get relief. Someone else does the thinking. Someone else provides the answers. You get to belong. Jung described this trade with a kind of unsettling tenderness, not as an attack, but almost as a seduction, because that's what it actually feels like from the inside. He wrote about that gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood, into the paradise of parental care, into happy-go-luckiness and irresponsibility. All the thinking and looking after done from the top, an answer for every question, provision made for every need. Read that again slowly, and ask yourself honestly whether you've ever wanted exactly that. Not tyranny imposed on you from outside, relief you reached for yourself. That description is from an essay Jung wrote in 1957, at the height of Cold War terror, with the Iron Curtain freshly drawn across Europe, and the possibility of nuclear annihilation sitting in the background of every serious thought anyone had. He called it the undiscovered self, and it's the one time in his career he took the exact same clinical instrument he used on individual patients, dreams, complexes, the shadow, the unconscious, and pointed it outward, at an entire civilization, to ask a genuinely frightening question. What happens to a person's psyche when they get absorbed into something much bigger than themselves? He opens the essay with 4 words that could be published today without changing a syllable. What will the future bring? This isn't a Cold War history lesson. It's a diagnosis of a mechanism that doesn't care what decade it's running in, or what particular thing you're dissolving into. Jung happened to be looking at Soviet communism and the memory of Nazism when he wrote this. The mechanism he found underneath both of them is running today in places that have nothing to do with governments at all. And by the end of this, you'll recognize it operating in your own life somewhere, because it almost certainly is. Here's the actual argument, stripped down to its spine. Jung noticed something happening in the culture around him that he considered genuinely dangerous, and it wasn't a specific ideology. It was a way of seeing people. The modern world, he argued, had organized itself increasingly around statistics, averages, categories, large numbers, and the more a society thinks in those terms, the more the actual specific, irrational human being standing in front of you quietly disappears. Not disappears literally. Disappears as a unit anyone is required to care about. He put it plainly. Scientific education is based in the main on statistical truths and abstract knowledge, and therefore imparts an unrealistic, rational picture of the world, in which the individual, as a merely marginal phenomenon, plays no role. And sharper still, describing what happens to a person once they've been folded into that picture. As a social unit, he has lost his individuality and become a mere abstract number in the Bureau of Statistics. He can only play the role of an interchangeable unit of infinitesimal importance. Sit with how strange that claim actually is, coming from a psychologist. He's not saying statistics are false. He's saying they're true about nobody in particular. There is no average man standing anywhere. There's only you, specific and contradictory and irrational, and a civilization that has started organizing itself entirely around a fictional stand-in for you. Now, this is where most coverage of this essay stops, treats it as a piece of mid-century political commentary, and moves on. That's a mistake, because the far more interesting question is the one Jung actually spends most of the essay answering. Why do people let this happen to themselves? Not why does a state impose it? Why does a person consent to it, sometimes even crave it? His answer runs straight through the same architecture this channel has covered before. The relationship between the ego and the unconscious, and the sheer effort required to remain a differentiated individual, instead of dissolving back into something undifferentiated and collective. Being a full, separate person is expensive. It requires holding your own contradictions, tolerating uncertainty, taking responsibility for judgments nobody else is going to make for you. Dissolving into a crowd removes all of that overhead in one motion. You don't have to decide what's true anymore. The group already decided. You don't have to sit with moral ambiguity anymore. The group already assigned who the good people are and who the enemy is. That's the gentle and painless slipping back Jung is describing. It's not a con being run on unwilling victims. It's a nervous system finding the path of least resistance, the same way water finds the low ground. And mass movements exist specifically because that low ground is always there, always available, always slightly downhill from the effort of staying an individual. Jung takes this one level deeper, into territory that gets genuinely uncomfortable. He argues that when a culture's traditional religious structure erodes, when people stop believing in the God their grandparents believed in, the psychological function that religion used to serve doesn't simply vanish. The hunger for something larger than yourself to submit to, something that supplies meaning and moral certainty and belonging, doesn't go away just because its original object stopped being credible. It goes looking for a replacement. And Jung's specific, sharper claim is that the mass state, or the ideology, or the movement, is very often exactly what's standing there, waiting to receive that displaced religious energy. He wasn't being metaphorical about this. The mass state has no intention of promoting mutual understanding and the relationship of man to man. It strives rather for atomization, for the psychic isolation of the individual. Isolating you from other actual people, he's saying, while simultaneously offering you belonging to the abstraction itself, the movement, the cause, the state, is not a contradiction. It's the whole mechanism working exactly as designed. You lose your neighbor and gain a flag. He was looking at mid-century totalitarian movements specifically when he wrote this. But notice that nothing about the underlying appetite he's describing is limited to governments. A psyche that has an unmet hunger for something transcendent to submit to doesn't check whether the thing offering itself is a state, a corporation, an ideological movement, or an online community organized entirely around who the shared enemy is this week. The appetite doesn't care about the shape of its object. It only cares that something is offering to fill it. So here's the actual uncomfortable question this essay is asking you, personally, right now. What have you handed that appetite to? Where in your life have you traded the exhausting work of being a specific, contradictory individual for the relief of belonging to something that's already decided what's true and who's to blame? Jung's proposed defense against all of this is the part almost nobody covers, because it's the least dramatic answer imaginable, and also the most demanding. He doesn't propose political reform. He doesn't propose activism or better institutions or smarter policy. His answer is stubbornly, entirely psychological. The only real counterweight to mass-mindedness is an individual who has actually done the work of knowing themselves, including, especially, the parts of themselves they would much rather not look at. Here's his logic, and it's sharper than it first sounds. A person who has genuinely confronted their own capacity for cruelty, self-deception, and moral failure, who has done real work with their own shadow, is much harder to recruit into a movement that runs on projecting evil outward onto a designated enemy. They already know where their own darkness lives. They're not available to be told for the first time that evil exists somewhere else, conveniently located in the other group, because they've already had to sit with the fact that it exists in them. It's the person who hasn't done that work, who still quietly believes they're simply one of the good ones, uncomplicated, on the right side by default, who is the easiest recruit into a crowd that defines itself entirely against a common enemy. Self-knowledge in this essay is not therapeutic self-improvement. Jung frames it as something closer to civic infrastructure. The one thing standing between a functioning society and a mass psychosis is how many of its individual members have actually looked at their own shadow instead of only ever finding it in someone else. That's a genuinely strange claim for a psychologist to make in 1957, and it's stranger still that it's barely discussed today. Your personal shadow work, the private, unglamorous effort of admitting what you don't like about yourself is, in Jung's own framing, a form of political resistance. Decades before that phrase existed. A few honest things worth sitting with before you take this too far. Jung was writing with the USSR and the recent memory of Nazism directly in front of him. He is not describing modern algorithmic culture, and it would be dishonest to claim he predicted social media. What he described is a mechanism, and the claim worth making is narrower and more defensible. The container changes decade to decade, but the appetite underneath it doesn't seem to. It's also fair to say his proposed solution, individual self-knowledge, scaled up to an entire society, is a compelling psychological insight and a genuinely difficult thing to build a functioning civilization on top of. He doesn't pretend it's an easy fix. And Jung's own history with nationalism and mass psychology in the years before this essay is a real documented point of controversy among historians of psychology. Worth knowing exists, not something this essay resolves, and arguably part of why he was writing about this subject so seriously this late in his life at all. None of that weakens the core observation. If anything, it sharpens it. A man who had reason to examine his own relationship to mass movements more carefully than most people ever have, to spent the last years of his life writing, in plain terms, that the individual who refuses to look at their own capacity for darkness is the one a crowd can always use. So the actual question this essay leaves you with isn't about the Cold War, or communism, or any specific government at all. It's about the specific quiet moments in your own life where the relief of belonging to something bigger felt better than the effort of remaining fully, separately, inconveniently yourself. And whether you've ever stopped to ask what, exactly, that relief cost you.